What we're going to do, I'm going to give a brief intro about myself. I'm going to talk about some of the pervading issues in science today. We're going to talk about the foundations of Desci, and then really these new network states that are being enabled in biotech and medicine, and about some of the active use cases that are happening in the space today. So who am I? I got really interested in various online biohacking communities as a teenager. So these were communities, for example, looking at various nootropic substances, looking at psychedelic substances, different gene therapies, for example, in HIV, or, for example, new ways of producing insulin at home. And what mostly connected these people were that a given need, a patient need mostly, was not being met by industry. So as a teenager, I thought this was really interesting. I went on and was trading biotech stocks during university, studied economics, and then learned about crypto in about 2013, 14, and found that a really interesting and fascinating movement. And the similarities between crypto and software development and biotech are actually quite strong in terms of how open systems could fundamentally serve humanity. Cool. So science today is full of problems. Funding today for a young scientist is very hard to obtain and is highly competitive. So scientists typically spend up to 80% of their time actually applying for funding, applying for grants or VC, and 20% of the time doing the research. That's kind of the statistic that we found. Then science today is very hard to reproduce. So much of the scientific work that gets published, a lot of the data is actually not reproducible. Many scientists and scientific organizations work in silos in competition with each other rather than really sharing data openly, which is how science should work. Science really itself has become hyper competitive in terms of this narrative of publish or perish. And most of the scientific funding actually goes to decorated scientists in the field, not necessarily young, new, promising scientists. So it's very much a political process today. And then science to the broader public is really often inaccessible. So, and much of the kind of scientific literature that does get published stays behind paywalls. The funding itself, so many of these problems actually come from centralizing authorities. So funding itself is often centralized by governments or by private institutions, so the givers of funding. And the public is actually largely excluded today from making decisions around what happens with the funding. So very famously, for example, a lot of drug development research, a lot of medicinal basic research is funded by taxpayer money, but then ultimately is fully kind of commercialized by industry. And as taxpayers, as citizens, we don't really have a say in terms of what gets funded or what it actually costs to access a medication once it comes to market. And this really has to do with how scientific communities have been centralized over time around universities rather than being able to operate in a much more open environment. Another big thing is that we often say that this is the era of biotech. So there's been so many advances in the biotech field over the past 10 to 20 years. And despite that, drug prices have actually just continuously gone up. And over the past 5 to 6 to 7 years, funding in biotech is really caught in kind of a global macro ice age. So since 2017, 18, 19, funding for biotech has continuously dropped, and it's now hitting some of the lowest levels since 2017. And if we look at the macroeconomic perspective around this, Goldman Sachs wrote a famous article in 2018, and it asked, is curing patients a sustainable business model? And fundamentally, it's not. Because as a pharmaceutical company, you don't necessarily want to bring cures to market, you want to bring treatments to market. So there was a really famous case of a company called Gilead, some of you might know, that brought a hepatitis C drug to market. And this drug was so effective that it effectively cured the patient population within a treatment of 3 to 6 months. And Gilead previously had a lot of treatments for hepatitis C on the market. And so they effectively shot themselves in the foot by bringing a cure to market that hurt their own revenue. And analysts at Goldman Sachs and other global investment banks downgraded Gilead based on this decision to bring a cure to market. The executive who was in charge at the time actually got sacked 2 years later for bringing a cure to market. Then there's two charts here, which are US drug overdose deaths that have kind of continuously been rising, and it's kind of due to the same underlying incentive structure that you kind of want to bring drugs to market that fundamentally create users and addicts, not necessarily that cure them. And this has continuously led to major public health crises in the United States. There's also a very high overlap, for example, of the amount of Adderall prescriptions in the United States and the rise in methamphetamine addiction. So could we have a better model? I said this earlier, scientists today spend 80% of their time applying for funding and 20% doing the science. And our thesis at Molecule is, and the thesis for decentralized science, is that most of the world's potential scientific talent today actually remains untapped. So we talked about funding earlier and the centralization of funding. Funding is concentrated at some of the top universities in the US and some in Europe. You have Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Stanford, MIT. But if you're a researcher, for example, at Newcastle University or at a smaller university, it's really, really hard to get funding. So what is Desci? Desci is really a new movement that aims to build public infrastructure for funding, creating, reviewing, crediting, storing, and disseminating scientific knowledge fairly and equitably using Web3 technology. So Desci really aims to enable open collaboration for scientists and industry, the trustless exchange of data and IP, and in some way, you could think of this as making science self-sovereign. So in today's system, for example, if an idea emerges in the pharmaceutical industry or in the biotech industry that would be a cure, for example, to a disease that currently has a lot of treatments and is generating a lot of revenue, in today's system, often that science actually gets buried because people don't want it to come to market. And so this concept of Desci for us really also means self-sovereign science. Like if a cure is being developed, then that cure should be funded by patients and it should make it to market. So Desci today operates really already as a collaborative ecosystem. And this is kind of like an overview of some of the companies that are already operating and working in the Desci space. You have various different DAOs that are working in different disease areas. You have ecosystems. You have companies focusing on biotech, such as our company. Art in the scientific field, data storage protocols. This is from October last year. So this ecosystem map would already be quite a bit larger. And Desci has really been around, I'd say, for about 2 years. Yeah. So these are some of the Desci verticals that we have. So there's funding, intellectual property, and kind of research and development DAOs. DAO stands for decentralized organizations. There's decentralized publishing. So actually bringing scientific publications out of paywalls and into the open public domain. There's reproducibility of data, so actually enabling on-chain computation and verification of scientific data that is published. Because often in today's world, it's actually, if a scientist publishes a specific data set and says, cool, I ran this study, it yielded this data, it's really hard to reproduce it often. And the last part being identity and reputation systems for scientists. So of these verticals, DAOs and intellectual property are seeing some of the most progress. It's also where our company is very active. I'm going to briefly talk about kind of patents, our problem child today. So IP, intellectual property as an asset class, has really barely evolved or even been digitized. We're still using the same system that we developed in the 50s and 60s. Some of it is based on legal innovation from the 1800s, actually. And so filing a patent, still, you file patents with different patent offices around the world, and then that patent is now enforced by kind of the state. And it grants you exclusive rights to kind of now price your innovation in the world. So patents are fundamentally monopolistic, and they create really perverse incentives for collaboration. For example, if I'm a scientist at a university and I'm studying certain small molecules that could inhibit cancers, and I look at the small molecules and I'm like, oh, this has already been patented by Pfizer, for example, then I'm like, oh, can't touch it, can't work on it. There's not even a point in getting in touch and being like, hey, could I study this? Even if Pfizer has never done any work on that particular compound. It's just like ring fencing innovation and ring fencing science. They're fundamentally analog today in a digital world. So literally, it's like boxes of papers to file your patents, and then not hearing back for like 2 or 3 years from the patent office. They're really illiquid, so it's very hard to transact in patents, to transfer them, or to use them as an incentive. So we typically package a patent into an equity vehicle, a company, a startup, that then has to raise financing in order to. But for example, in the biotech world, when one company buys another company, they're not buying it for the team or anything else. It's really just to get the IP. And then licensing, if you've ever worked with a tech transfer office at a university, licensing today really lacks global standardized frameworks that would make it easy to fund this early stage innovation. So at Molecule, our goal is really to revolutionize how intellectual property works, specifically in early stage drug development. But the frameworks that we're building can be applied in science quite broadly. This is kind of a typical innovation cycle that you have in drug development today. So there's many ideas that are being developed, for example, to treat a specific disease. And this is what is typically known as the drug development cycle. You have early stage discovery of new compounds. You then move into preclinical testing in flies or in mice, for example. Then you move into phase 1 studies in humans. And ultimately, today, this process can take up to 10 years. Costs upwards of $1 to $2 billion. And this is because it's being done in quite an inefficient system today. You now have to imagine diseases are a global phenomenon, like many people have them, right? But yet, companies don't collaborate, so all of these patents are being essentially developed in silos. So the way that we're going about this, we've developed a new framework called an IP NFT, which we fundamentally see as a building block for decentralized science. So IP NFTs enable you to attach real-world legal licenses or patents to an NFT, and fundamentally through that make them programmable. So you could program royalties and ownership. You can make them transactable. You now make them highly liquid in the same way that you can, if you've ever transferred an NFT, it can take up to, takes a minute. And you can also make them data rich. So these IP NFTs you can kind of imagine as like decentralized Google Drives, where you can now give access rights to different players that are now collaborating on that IP development. I'm gonna skip this. How are we doing on time? Yeah, okay. And so what we're now building is essentially a marketplace where different research projects are featured from universities, from scientists across the globe, and we make them investable and fundable. And now, who are the main kind of users of such a marketplace today? So we've developed a new kind of organizational design framework called a biotech DAO, or a decentralized biotech organization. And so biotech DAOs are now really translational, community-centric biotech organizations and IP portfolios. So they essentially enable funding, incubation, spin-out, and kind of the sustainable development of these early-stage research projects. So you can kind of imagine them as decentralized, patient-led pharmaceutical companies. Just that they're not companies, but that they reinvest all of any profits that they make into funding further research. I'm going to give a brief example of one of the first, one of these biotech DAOs, which is VitaDAO. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It's really one of the leading Desci organizations funding longevity research and drug discovery. So VitaDAO has already funded over 14 projects with over $6 million. Has about, I think by now, 20,000 members globally. Has a market capitalization of 80 million, I think 200 million fully diluted. These are some of the research projects that VitaDAO has already funded. And so now this is all happening in a fully, completely decentralized way. No patent offices involved. VitaDAO doesn't even have a legal entity. So these research projects now get collated, collected by the community. And we're now scaling this approach. So if any of you are interested, our company is giving out $100,000 grants through a program called BioXYZ, where we're essentially incubating biotech DAOs. So these are some of the other DAOs that we're helping incubate. One of them is called Valley DAO, which is focused on synthetic biology. So that's actually a topic that's really close to our heart. One is Athena DAO, focused on women's reproductive health. One is called Hair DAO, focused on hair loss research, huge global patient population and community. One is called Cryo DAO, focused on funding research in cryopreservation. Yeah, these are some of the examples of how they work. You essentially have governance that happens through big Discord servers. If you've ever used Discord, it's kind of like, so we're really kind of gamifying the way that science works, the way that drug development works in community-centric structures. Yeah, for us, we're at an inflection point. I think science really needs to kind of break out of kind of these previous crusty structures that we've created into a much more open and collaborative environment. An environment where anyone can fund and participate in science independent of institution and geography. And a space where scientists are doing 80% of their time doing the science and only 20% of the time applying for funding. Cool, thank you so much.